Search for Nancy Guthrie. We do know 3 people were detained.
There are cases that begin quietly and end loudly. And then there are cases like this one, cases that begin quietly, stay quiet, and somehow become even more unsettling because of that silence. The disappearance of Nancy Guthrie is one of those cases. It did not start with screaming neighbors or a neighborhood on lockdown. It did not begin with broken glass or a frantic 911 call at 2 in the morning. It began the way most ordinary evenings begin, with dinner, with warmth, with the kind of peaceful domesticity that nobody thinks twice about. And that is precisely what makes what happened next so deeply disturbing. When federal agents entered Nancy Guthrie's home, they were not greeted by chaos. They were greeted by something far harder to interpret: order. Everything looked exactly as it should have. Too exactly. And in the world of federal investigation, when something looks too perfect, that is not a sign of innocence. That is a signal that someone very deliberate was involved. Something inside those walls told the FBI enough that they came back a second time. And when the FBI comes back, it is never without reason. What did they find? Why did it shake the entire trajectory of the case? Stay with us because this story is far more layered than it first appears. Nancy Guthrie was, by every account that has emerged from this investigation, a woman of routine. She was careful about her life, careful about the company she kept, and careful about the environment she placed herself in. People who knew her described her as someone who did not take unnecessary risks. She was not the kind of person who made impulsive decisions or placed herself in dangerous situations. That portrait matters because it makes the circumstances surrounding her disappearance all the more confounding. The evening she went missing had begun as dozens of evenings before it had, unremarkably. She had spent time around people she was comfortable with. The mood was relaxed. There was no tension that anyone could recall afterward, no argument that lingered in the air, no look exchange that caused concern. When people are later asked to reflect on a night that turned out to be the last ordinary one they shared with someone, they searched desperately for a warning sign they might have missed. In Nancy's case, those close to her kept coming up empty. The evening was genuinely, painfully normal. She arrived back at her home just before 10 o'clock that night. Law enforcement was able to confirm that timeline. What they chose not to confirm, at least not publicly, was the identity of whoever brought her there. That omission is not incidental. In investigations of this nature, investigators speak carefully and omit deliberately. When a piece of information is withheld from public statements, it is almost always because revealing it would either compromise the investigation or because that detail is directly relevant to someone currently under scrutiny. The identity of the driver was, from early on, considered sensitive. That sensitivity alone tells a story. When investigators first entered Nancy's home after she was reported missing, they approached it the way federal agents are trained to approach any scene: methodically, without assumption, and with attention to what the space itself communicates. Every home has a rhythm. There is a logic to how things are arranged, how doors are left, which lights were on, what was on the counter, what was in the sink. Those details, collectively, paint a portrait of the last moments before everything changed. What they found was a home that appeared entirely undisturbed. No forced entry at the doors. No broken windows. No furniture displaced. No signs of a physical confrontation. Not a knocked-over glass, not a scuff mark on the floor, not a single item out of its expected place. In the vast majority of abduction cases or violent encounters, the physical environment tells that story loudly. There is almost always evidence of urgency, of someone who had no time to be careful, or of a victim who fought back. Here there was none of that. For investigators, an absence of evidence is never simply a neutral observation. It becomes its own category of evidence. When there is no disorder, it means one of several things. The person left willingly, the person left with someone they trusted entirely, or someone with significant composure and planning capability removed them without leaving a trace of disruption behind. None of those options are reassuring. In fact, when measured against the reality that Nancy did not return, each of those possibilities carries its own weight of dread. The agents documented everything. They photographed the home room by room. They cataloged items, noted positions, flagged anything that seemed even slightly inconsistent with what someone who lived in a comfortable routine would have arranged. It was painstaking, quiet work. And then, in a development that caught the attention of those following the case closely, the home was processed, cleared, and then revisited. A second visit to a scene that has already been processed is not standard. It does not happen because investigators had extra time or felt like double-checking their work out of habit. A revisit happens when something shifts the lens through which existing evidence must be re-examined. Something changed in the information available to the FBI, something new that made previously unremarkable details suddenly significant. This is an important distinction to understand. The FBI was not returning because they had found nothing the first time. They were returning because something they had already collected, or something that had emerged in a parallel thread of the investigation, recontextualized what was inside that home. A detail that looks meaningless on day 1 of a missing persons case can look entirely different on day 6, when phone records have been pulled, when digital timelines have been reconstructed, when the accounts given by various individuals have been compared and inconsistencies have surfaced. Federal investigators operate on layers. The physical layer is always the first, what can be seen, touched, and photographed. But behind that is a digital layer, and in the modern era of smart home devices, networked appliances, and personal electronics, that digital layer is often more revealing than the physical one. When agents return to a home with fresh questions, they are often there to reconcile the physical reality of the space with what the digital record has shown them. Did the front door sensor log a departure at a time nobody accounted for? Did a device connect to the home network and then vanish at a specific moment? Did a smart thermostat register a temperature change consistent with a door being left open for an extended period of time? These questions sound technical, but the answers they produce are devastatingly concrete. And something in the answers that were beginning to form sent agents back through Nancy Guthrie's front door a second time. Modern homes are, in many ways, passive witnesses. They observe without being asked to. A router logs every device that connects to and disconnects from it, time-stamped with a precision that human memory simply cannot replicate. A smart doorbell or camera captures footage not just of who comes and goes, but of when, and that when can either corroborate a timeline or blow one apart entirely. In Nancy's case, investigators were particularly focused on the digital architecture of her daily life. When was her phone last used? Was it used inside the home or outside of it? Did it ping a cell tower at a location that contradicted what someone else had told authorities? Were messages opened but not responded to, or were they simply never opened? These questions seem simple, but the answers are layered. A phone that goes completely silent at a specific time, never to show activity again, tells a very different story from one that shows gradual, scattered bursts of minimal activity in the days after someone disappears. The agents were also looking at behavioral digital patterns, the kind of thing that only becomes apparent when you compare a person's typical activity against the anomaly of a specific period. If Nancy ordinarily checked her phone in the early morning hours, and that pattern abruptly ceased at a precise moment, that cessation becomes a timestamp of significance. If a device that was usually present on her home network suddenly disappeared without being logged out in the usual manner, that is a disruption that demands explanation. What investigators found in this digital reconstruction was enough to change how they were looking at the case. Not dramatically, not loudly, but in that quiet, methodical way that actually signals the deepest kind of investigative momentum. The silence in the home was no longer just physical. It was digital too. And digital silence, unlike human silence, is almost impossible to fake convincingly. There is a concept that experienced investigators understand deeply, even if it is rarely discussed in public briefings: the staging of a scene. Most people assume that a crime scene is chaotic by nature. Television reinforces this instinct constantly. But in reality, some of the most disturbing scenes investigators encounter are the ones that are too clean, too orderly, too arranged. When a living space looks exactly as it should, not just relatively undisturbed but specifically, almost deliberately undisturbed, that precision begins to read differently. A person who leaves their home unexpectedly in a moment of crisis does not typically pause to ensure that their environment looks normal. They don't straighten a chair they bumped into. They don't close a cabinet they opened in haste. They don't ensure that every surface is free of the kind of casual disorder that comes with daily living. But a person who wants investigators to conclude that nothing happened? That person might take the time to ensure that things look exactly right. The FBI was examining the possibility, carefully, methodically, and without public confirmation, that what they were looking at inside Nancy's home was not a preserved slice of a normal evening. It may have been a constructed one. That distinction is enormous. Because if someone took the time to arrange what investigators would find, it means the events that occurred were premeditated. It means that whoever was involved understood enough about how scenes are processed to account for it in advance. That level of deliberateness narrows the field of probability significantly. As the investigation deepened, something else drew attention. Late one evening, law enforcement was observed arriving at the home of a relative connected to the case. They entered. They remained for several hours. The lights were on throughout. No emergency vehicles. No public statements followed. Just a quiet, deliberate visit conducted well past the hours when such things are typically expected. Visits like this are misread by the public more often than not. A late-night appearance by law enforcement at the home of someone connected to a missing persons case feels alarming, and the instinct is to interpret it as accusatory. But investigators who handle these cases know that such visits often serve a very different function. They are about precision. They are about sitting across from someone and measuring what they say against what the digital record shows. They are about giving a person one more opportunity to fill in a gap that has appeared in the timeline, a gap that, left unfilled, begins to look intentional. What was discussed during those hours is not public knowledge. It may never be. But the fact of the visit and the duration of it communicates something important. The investigation had moved from the broad sweep of early inquiry into the focused, narrow channel of specific interest. Agents were no longer asking general questions. They were asking very specific ones. And when investigators ask specific questions, it means they already know a significant portion of the answer and are measuring responses against it. When ransom communication entered the picture, the case formally escalated from a local missing persons matter into federal jurisdiction. Any communication that crosses state lines, utilizes electronic platforms, or introduces financial demands activates a different tier of law enforcement authority and protocol. The FBI's presence, which had already been established, became even more entrenched. But ransom notes introduce their own complexity. They do not automatically confirm an abduction. Investigators are trained to interrogate the origin and timing of such communications with the same skepticism they apply to every other element. Was the communication sent in real time, or was it scheduled? Does the language reflect genuine urgency or calculated imitation of urgency? Are the demands coherent and specific, or are they designed to impress rather than negotiate? These are not cynical questions, they are necessary ones. The FBI began analyzing the ransom communication not just for what it said, but for what it revealed about the person who crafted it. Word choice matters. Timing matters. The choice of platform matters. Errors, or the conspicuous absence of errors, matter. A communication that is too polished raises flags. A communication that introduces specific personal details that were not public knowledge raises different flags. Every element of those messages became a piece of a psychological portrait that investigators were building in parallel with the physical and digital evidence already gathered. There came a point in the public arc of this investigation where updates simply stopped. Statements became sparse. Press briefings grew shorter and then disappeared altogether. For those on the outside following the case, this silence felt like stagnation. It felt like the investigation had hit a wall, or that authorities had run out of answers. That interpretation is almost certainly wrong. When investigators go quiet in a case like this, it is rarely because nothing is happening. It is almost always because too much is happening, and too much of it is sensitive. Releasing partial information in a case involving active negotiations, ransom communication, or suspects who may be monitoring media coverage is not just unproductive. It is dangerous. Every detail confirmed publicly is a detail that can be used by whoever is responsible to calibrate their next move. The FBI's silence in the Nancy Guthrie case was deliberate. It was protective. And for those who understand how federal investigations function, the depth of that silence was itself an indicator. When agencies go this quiet, it typically means that the investigation has entered a phase where specific individuals are under active scrutiny, where evidence is being assembled in preparation for action rather than exploration, and where the risk of premature disclosure outweighs any benefit of public transparency. The silence was not the absence of a story. It was the story, told in the language that investigators use when they are close to something real. What the FBI ultimately found inside Nancy Guthrie's home was not a single dramatic revelation. It was a convergence, a layering of small, individually unremarkable details that, when assembled in sequence and viewed alongside the digital record, the behavioral patterns and the communications analysis, produced a picture that shifted everything. The order of the home was part of it. The digital timestamps were part of it. The identity of who brought her home that evening was part of it. The content and timing of the ransom communication was part of it. And the information gathered during that late-night visit to the relative's home was part of it. Taken separately, none of these elements would be sufficient to redirect a federal investigation. But taken together, in the way that experienced agents are trained to read them, they painted a portrait of events that were not random, not opportunistic, and not the result of a stranger's impulsive decision. The picture that was forming was one of planning, of familiarity, of someone who understood Nancy's routines, her home, and the way her disappearance would be initially interpreted. That is perhaps the most chilling element of what investigators found. Not a piece of physical evidence left carelessly behind, but the unmistakable fingerprint of premeditation, visible not in what was there, but in what had been so carefully, deliberately removed. Nancy Guthrie's case is still unfolding. The answers, all of them, have not yet been made public. But what we know from the pattern of this investigation, from the FBI's return to her home, from the quiet late-night visits and the deepening silence from authorities, is that this case is being taken with the utmost seriousness. The people working it are not spinning their wheels. They are building something. Methodically, carefully. And when what they are building is complete, it will not be small. The home that looked perfectly normal held something that changed this entire case. Not with noise,